CBC News has learned that Ottawa and Alberta have agreed to the broad strokes of a potential new oil pipeline to British Columbia's northwest coast. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle set to sign a memorandum of understanding on Thursday in Calgary. Multiple sources tell CBC News the agreement is expected to include carve-outs for Alberta on environmental regulations. The province would adopt stricter industrial carbon pricing in exchange. There's currently no concrete proposal or corporate backing for any new pipeline. The plan also faces heavy opposition from the BC government and coastal First Nations. Richard Masson is my guest here. He's executive fellow, at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. He's also a former CEO of the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission. He joins us in Calgary. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Angie.
As you heard me sort of outline here this memorandum of understanding, give me a sense of your impressions of this. It's not necessarily, as we're labeling it, a deal, but it's very loosely that.
For sure. It's the beginning of a process to work towards a pipeline. Of course, a pipeline has been very difficult to build in Canada for quite some time. Energy East failed, Northern Gateway, which was going to Kitimat, failed. Trans Mountain had to be taken over by the government. So there's a long ways to go between a memorandum of understanding and getting to a pipeline that can actually be constructed. And we'll have to see what the memorandum says. But I guess the encouraging part is Alberta and the federal government are working together for a change on a common purpose and trying to correct some of the laws that were put in place that really hampered the development of our resource industry. And if we can get that to happen, that's a good thing for Canadian investors, for jobs and investment, and probably for taxes and royalties.
And that's also going to include the Pathways Alliance carbon capture and storage project to be built. So walk me through that as well and how that's going to address emissions.
Of course, the oil sands are a huge resource, and we've grown production by a couple million barrels a day over the last decade or so. And so that's resulted in more CO2 coming from Canada. The approach that the federal government had been taking was multi-layered. So it was the industrial carbon price. Alberta's had one for the longest time in Canada. And the federal government thought, well, that's not doing enough, so we have to put an emissions cap on oil and gas. And that just led to conflict. And it wasn't really leading to the desired outcome because there was more fighting than there was actual action. Pathways Alliance is a group of oil sands operators who are intending to invest over $16.5 billion to capture CO2 from existing oil sands facilities and pipe it and bury it underground, which Alberta's been doing for a decade, Saskatchewan even for longer. Mm-hmm. So we know that we can do this. It's just a question of finding the right balance around the cost, who's going to pay for the cost to put the CO2 in the ground. And that'll be a partnership between the federal government, the Alberta government, and the industry to make that happen. So that's an actual way to get CO2 reductions in place.
All of this sort of heeds on, of course, British Columbia, First Nations groups. As I said, it's a memorandum of understanding that's supposed to come out on Thursday. But if we look at sort of the details and I guess the bigger picture of what this is supposed to mean, and we look at oil and the presence of oil in markets sort of down the road, does it make financial sense when countries, provinces here in Canada, of course, things are shifting away from oil? At least that's what the trajectory is in the long run.
Yeah, I'd say two things. Trans Mountain is now up and running, and so there's about a tanker a day called an Aframax, about 550,000 barrels a day, 600,000 barrels a day. One of those tankers each day moves out of the Burnaby terminal and off to Asia primarily. So we're doing it now, and we know we can do it. Mm-hmm. There's an Aframax-sized tanker berths being constructed right now at the Vopak and AltaGas terminal in Prince Rupert. So that says that it's okay, it's safe enough to move those kind of tankers for different products. And the question becomes, well, what's the long-term outlook for oil? Many scenarios show oil is at least going to stay as in demand over the next 20 years as it is today. And so, even the latest IEA forecast, the current policy scenario actually showed growth going up more than 10% by 2050. So there's lots of different scenarios. But in the scheme of all of that, Canada is only about 4% of the global market. And certainly we can continue to produce our oil if we do it with things like pathways to make it environmentally responsible. We can continue to be a good oil producer for the long term and meet global needs.
With that being said, then, and we've heard from the BC Premier on this, David Eby, pushing hard, and ministers as well pushing back, saying there's no real deal here, no real project, because there's no actual money that's backing it yet. And then we've got the involvement of Indigenous groups that their input and their say is critical in all of this. If those factors are still at play and haven't been has solidified, where do you see this going?
I think the biggest risk remains with the coastal First Nations and their objection to removing the tanker ban. And that's a huge thing because you can't short circuit that in any way. The courts have ruled multiple times that the federal government hasn't done an adequate job consulting and accommodating Indigenous groups. That was demonstrated on Northern Gateway and on TMX. The other big challenge is the pipeline TMX cost $34 billion. And if people knew that at the beginning, they wouldn't have built it. It's too expensive. And so the question becomes, if you're looking at a pipeline to the West Coast, what's your actual cost? And is that toll going to be competitive with alternatives like rail? Because you can rail diluted bitumen to parts of North America or other places. There are expansion opportunities on TMX and on the Enbridge mainline system that compete for those barrels. And if this pipeline is too expensive, nobody's going to be prepared to build it. The other challenge, of course, is it probably takes you $400 or $500 million of feasibility studies to even figure out if the pipeline is going to be viable and who's going to pay for that, because certainly pipeline companies aren't stepping up. And is government going to have to step up and backstop those kind of costs? This all remains to be seen. Which is
where leads you now to my next question in terms of the federal government's role and purpose around this, the timing as well. We know that Prime Minister Mark Carney, in terms of his background trajectory to his career, very much business in terms of looking at where things need to navigate and having those business discussions as we're seeing here with the various leaders, premiers, et cetera. Why do you think this is happening now? Is it a level of political posturing to make good with Alberta?
I think there was a lot of folks who understood that the policies that the last government had in place were not working. And so the industrial carbon price was falling apart. The price for credits in Alberta was $20, $25 a ton because there was too many relative to demand. And nobody's going to build a pathways project for billions of dollars if they can't get value for their credits. The adding on of the emissions cap carbon price just layered on. They were calling it pancaking. Too many overlapping regulations that didn't work together to achieve their goal. And so I think one of the things that Alberta was arguing is we need to take some of those barriers away if we're going to have any hope of growing production. And unless we can grow production, we're not going to get a pipeline. The federal government is essentially doing that, saying we're going to try and fix some of these things that weren't working properly. And if that happens, then you have the ability to bring forward a pipeline proposal. There's no approval for it yet, but at least it gives a fighting chance that somebody could bring that forward and production could grow over the coming decade.
Richard, really appreciate you giving us your time on this. Richard Masson, thank you.
You're welcome.